Before I start this video, I want to make sure people know that I'm not an expert in the field of military vehicles or strategy. I'm simply an amateur enthusiast. My sources are what I can get my hands on, and input being research, analysis, and supposition of what I can figure out to most likely be accurate. The sources I use mainly consist of people such as David Fletcher, PM Knight, Peter Samsonov, and some others. We'll talk more about all this at the end, but for now let's get to the meat and potatoes of the video. Enjoy. Ever since I can remember, my father loved video games, and he shared that love with me as soon as I was able to use a keyboard and mouse. One of the very first games we played together was Myst. From that wonderful start in the world of gaming, a game of intrigue and mystery and puzzle solving requiring critical thinking, I was next introduced to other games that were totally appropriate for my age, like Unreal Tournament, Half-Life, Max Payne, and eventually the original Call of Duty, a competitor to Medal of Honor that's now become...
I am Cornelius! I need tippy for my bunghole!
Yeah, that. However, it was that game that really sparked my interest in the World Wars. The craziness of the times, the unique inventions and vehicles that range from new but useful items we take for granted today, to batshit insane pieces of equipment such as the Spigot Mortar anti-tank projector called the Piat, the DD tanks that could not only float but propel themselves from ships to shore, and even a device that allowed the STG-44 to shoot over or around cover called the Krumlauf. All these things were the result of panic, mad scientists, or both. Mostly both. However, the interest faded. Until I managed to play Company of Heroes 1 and the UK expansion. All these new and interesting vehicles that Call of Duty 1 never had. New soldiers, new vehicles, accents that weren't American, German, or Russian. I so badly wanted to learn more about this part of history that seemed to be missing from most of the media I'd consumed about the war. It was one of the missions in the campaign, I think it was the third one, that revealed to me a tank that I would fall in love with. A tracked and armoured vehicle armed with a 2-pounder gun and could be dropped in via a glider. A glider! A tank that was airborne. It blew my little bird brain that such a thing could exist. Now that I'm older, much older, I now have the ability to research and tell others about my little tank that tried but just couldn't. So stick around and I'll tell you about the cutest tank, my favourite tank, and arguably one of the worst performing light tanks the British fielded during the war, the Vickers Armstrong's Light Tank Mark 7 or the A17, otherwise known by its more recognisable name, the Tetrarch.
Die Tommies haben die Anhöhe heute eingenommen. Man weiß nicht, wann sie hier eintreffen. Auf jeden Fall haben sie mehr drauf als die Amis.
Na, hoffentlich bleibt uns die Nacht.
Ja, im Dunkel der Nacht bleibt manches verborgen.
The Tetrarch was born out of a mixture of good ideas from the Good Idea Fairy, combined with an assumption of what war would be, and what they thought it needed, meeting the war that was actually happening, ending up with a vehicle that nobody really knew what to do with. Most people know it from its role as the tank that can be flown in, all super sneaky-like to wreak havoc to the soft underbelly of the German rear lines, an unexpected armoured fist, take out tanks and armoured cars that would accompany commando units to allow the British to be an unstoppable force. It was so successful that a number were even sent to the Soviet Union after Barbarossa. Nothing can stop this plucky little David of a tank versus the Goliath of Nazi armour. The reality is a lot less exciting than that. In truth, the Tetrarch was something that the War Office didn't really know what to do with or how to deploy them, especially with the change in doctrine, despite on paper having a number of advantages that makes it seem quite a useful little tank for recon and scouting. However, with everything going on with the limitations and pressures caused by the British retreat from Dunkirk, many designs were accepted on paper that would have benefited from more time being tested and compared, as well as sticking with already approved designs that weren't very suitable, but after such a loss of equipment, any tank's better than no tank. The Tetrarch is one of those vehicles that should have remained on the drawing board, or at least given more time to develop, create new versions of it, see what worked and what didn't. But since some were already being built and were finished being built, they were pushed into positions and roles it never should have been in. Being a product from Vickers Armstrongs, and I'm doing my best not to call it Vickers Armstrong, but 1.5 of my 2 brain cells keeps leaving out the last S, it was a response to the issues with earlier models of light tanks, where there was a lack of adequate firepower to deal with other tanks in the battlefield. Think of something like the original Renault FT17, as the Americans dubbed it. That it was a light tank that can move quickly and have a machine gun or a cannon on it. A lot of light tanks that Vickers Armstrongs put forward in the past only had machine guns, so the Tetrarch was there to make up for that lack of firepower. It was initially designed as a tank for export, not necessarily for the War Office immediately, but it was presented to the War Office for assessment. The War Office themselves were looking at it and the Cruiser Mark I to start on their new kind of fast tank line. Seeing the Tetrarch as too lightly armoured, they rightfully decided to go with the Cruiser Mark I, which would eventually evolve into the Crusader tank. However, the Tetrarch wasn't totally left aside. An order was placed for about 120 Tetrarchs as one of the final tanks of the light tank program, preferring the idea of cruiser and infantry support tanks instead. Being the War Office, they bounced the number around mid-production, fucking things up for Vickers Armstrongs, until the War Office was told the materials for about 200-ish tanks were ordered. So in the end, they settled with whatever amount of tanks that Vickers Armstrongs could actually build with the materials they ordered. That number's in some dispute, ranging from 100 to 177. It's written that they ordered enough materials for 200 tanks. It could have been that some of those tanks were used in testing. I don't know. Numbers are unclear. If you know, let me know. Moving on, taking what they had learned from the previous incarnations of tracked armoured vehicles they had made, Vickers Armstrongs created a design that carried the British 2-pounder gun. At this point in time, the 2-pounder was a stout armament. Interwar and early tanks were rather susceptible to it, even being able to pierce the front armour of early Panzer III variants. Now, it had to be close and you had to be a bit lucky, but it could. Eventually, as the war went on, and the 2-pounder began to lack the necessary penetration power needed to even pierce the side armour of German tanks, newer ammunition, APCNR, or APSV as it was at the time, was introduced with the 2-pounder to work alongside the addition of the Little John adapter, a muzzle device for the 2-pounder that used the squeeze bore principle to essentially force the fired round to narrow as it squeezed through the muzzle device, increasing its velocity and penetration power. This was possible by having a softer metal body around a hard, penetrative core. The Little John adapter squeezed the diameter of the 40mm round to 30mm to improve velocity and effectiveness against armor. While penetration tables are only a vague ballpark given the massive variation in different testing parameters, in theory, it could pierce the side armour of many early to mid-war German tanks, especially at close range, and on a good day, the side armour of later war tanks. Yes, even the Tiger. No, this is not me glazing the 2-pounder, it's just the nature of how the weapon performed. It was a speedy enough little thing, being able to go over 60 km per hour, or 40 miles per hour in silly units on smooth roads, with speeds of about 40 km per hour, or about 24 miles per hour, at best off-road. This made it faster than many other light tanks at the time, like the Panzer I and Panzer II, the American M2 light tank, but slower than the Russian BT-7. All of which were tanks of approximately the same time, mid to late 30s. This made it a kind of hybrid between the capabilities of an armoured car and a tank. It even had a strange suspension and turning method that allowed it to be steered like a car, even having a steering wheel instead of levers for driving. However, when it comes to the Tetrarch, that's where the good news ends, and while you'll see that while on paper it should be a wonderful recon and support tank, its real-life performance was anything but. In reality, the Tetrarch had various flaws in its design that couldn't easily be overcome. Firstly, while I was researching the Tetrarch, I had full expectation that it used the Christie suspension, a rather unfortunate suspension that allowed for great on-road speed but terrible off-road stability and capabilities that the British used in quite a few tanks. No. Instead, the Tetrarch used a combination of air and oil for its suspension to dampen shocks and bumps using the different viscosity and compression. In theory, this is a good thing. Back after World War I, Citroën used a hydropneumatic suspension for its cars to allow people to drive comfortably over shelled and torn up roads and earth that used to be road. However, this implementation of that idea came with issues. There were reports of rough roads weakening suspension rather badly and making the ride even worse, or stopping the vehicle altogether. Any damage to the lines that fed the suspension systems could cause a failure of the system. The tanks that were sent to Russia after Barbarossa saw that in the deep cold, the whole tank, especially the suspension, suffered due to lower temperatures, impacting the densities and even freezing over entirely. Russians mainly used them for propaganda. There were some battles they were involved in, but they didn't perform very well. But their use for propaganda was to show that together the Allies could beat Nazi Germany, and that they appreciated the gesture, but in reality they would like some better tanks. Sadly, low temperatures weren't the only kind of environment that the Tetrarch suffered in. It was determined early on that the cooling system couldn't handle the heat of North Africa, and as such wasn't deployed there. It could have done quite well. A speedy 2-pounder small vehicle that could go over relatively smooth terrain without much issue could probably have performed quite well over there. The tracks are relatively thin, causing issues with softer terrain. However, with it being a light tank, it didn't struggle as much as other relatively heavier light tanks that used thin treads, so it wasn't perfect, it wasn't horrific. The gun, while good for its time and place, suffered because of the 2-man crew and became underpowered as the war went on. Being a 2-man crew in the turret meant that either the gunner or the commander had to load each shell after firing. This clearly became an issue in battle, where the gunner would either lose track of the target to reload, or the commander loses situational awareness of what's going on around them, making it difficult to command a squad of tanks. This gap in readiness and awareness would create confusion for the crew or the whole section, and would inevitably lead to more losses of tanks or crew. Losses that didn't need to happen if you had a 3-man turret. The Little John adapter, when attached, was seemingly impossible to remove, at least easily, and it prevented the use of the regular 2-pounder shells, which the production in England was much greater than the specialised shells, and the crews found that the special ammunition worked almost as well, but a bit shorter range, through the normal barrel. So why put on the adapter? It just limits the gun down to a specific ammunition that they don't have in as much abundance. So, more often than not, the adapter was just left aside. It was still in the tank, but not attached. The armour was particularly thin, at most 16mm thick at the front, going to 14 at the sides. Fine for most small arms, but armour-piercing rifle rounds, larger machine gun rounds, and any anti-tank weapons of the period could penetrate it. The Russians themselves said that if it was, let's say, guarding a convoy where it was expected to come up against people with submachine guns, it would be fine, but anything more, it was dubious. Having such thin armour made it poorly equipped to go head-to-head with other light tanks, or handle larger calibers of weapons, those tanks who may have been slower, but often had thicker armour. If the Tetrarch didn't get a good side shot off first on its target, then its only chance to survive was to run away and hope heavier friendly armour or anti-tank weapons could step in. This happened more often than not during its use, where in places like Madagascar, where it went up against old World War I French strongpoints, accompanied with Valentine tanks, it performed quite badly, with one Tetrarch falling out of the landing craft and blocking anything else from disembarking from it, and the other Tetrarchs that managed to went up against these old bunkers and defences and found that their gun wasn't good enough to penetrate the bunkers, and when they went with some Valentine tanks to flank around, they got utterly destroyed, with a single surviving Tetrarch of that flanking manoeuvre going back to the main force to report what happened. Now this leads us to D-Day, Operation Tonga, the most recognisable use of the Tetrarch. How it got its reputation as the flying tank, the tank that could sneak in along with commandos and ruin the Nazis' day before the landings at the beaches, and then help the British push on to Cannes on the first day objective. That, we know, didn't happen. Gliders, you see, were a popular method the British used for getting into German-occupied territories. The Hamilcar glider was one of the main frames used for this purpose. It was purpose-built for getting armour of some kind through the air and land in support of a main invasion or behind enemy lines. When the War Office discussed how to give support to infantry being dropped in via glider or parachute behind enemy lines, they wanted some kind of armour that could accompany them. The Universal Carrier, or Bren Carrier, an itty-bitty track ditty that I adore and would drive daily if I could, would fit in a Hamilcar, 2 at a time. However, no other British armour was light enough or small enough to fit in the glider without causing issues. Issues would show up nonetheless, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Looking at what armour they did have, they found they had the Tetrarch, a tank that no longer fit into regular armour division doctrine, but could be made to work in this airborne role. After some training and practice, resulting in more than a handful of deaths of glider pilots and crews, it was greenlit to be flown in along with the commandos for Operation Tonga, the British airborne invasion of Normandy on D-Day. Now this is where some people, thanks to a certain video game I love, think the Tetrarch was a great tank. In fact, a large portion of the few Tetrarchs that were sent never even got into contact with the enemy in France. One glider had its Tetrarch come loose, fall through the cabin of the glider, taking it, its crew, and the pilots out over the channel that night. Even after landing, there were losses before combat. One rolled over onto its top, coming out of the glider. The crew managed to get out, that's fine. They went on to crew other tanks, as far as I can recall. A number of them got caught up in parachute cord, and the crews couldn't cut them free, so they had to be left behind. They were unusable. The two that did survive the trip, the landing and the disembarking of the gliders, were lost fairly quickly. One to a mine, and one taken out by a German tank. Some Tetrarchs were converted to a close support role, changing the 2-pounder to a 3-inch howitzer, in the hopes they could support infantry, but it never really came to be. While the invasion succeeded, the Tetrarch was not a vital part of its success, nor was it even functionally a very useful part. It was an obsolete tank forced into a role due to its size and weight. Soon the tank would be pulled from service and was replaced with the American M22 Locust, a light tank purpose-built for the airborne role. The Tetrarch would be relegated to reserve status and then scrapped or sold off or what have you, with one remaining in the Tank Museum in Bovington in the UK and one in Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia. The longer-lasting legacy of the Tetrarch would be in the Daimler armoured car, which sported a Tetrarch turret and had a much more successful light as an armoured car, a video I may do in due time. As for the future of airborne light tanks, the concept didn't die with the Tetrarch or World War II. The British FV-101 Scorpion tank, which I have an attachment to since the Irish Army had some, the American M8 armoured gun system, which, let's just say I admire the sheer positivity they had in the design to put a gun like that on a hull like this, like damn, or even the German Weasel, which is so goddamn cute. Mostly Cold War designs, which again have seen limited use overall, but the concept of a light tank that can be transported by air still sees recurrence now and then. Most people nowadays would likely recognise this tank as being in Girls on Panzer, Company of Heroes 1, World of Tanks, and War Thunder. In the first, it's represented mostly how it was in real life. Eager but incapable. Both Company of Heroes 1 and War Thunder have a more positive, optimistic representation of the tank. The Tetrarch can take a few anti-tank rounds in Company of Heroes, albeit still one of the squishiest tracked vehicles in the game. In War Thunder, the penetration of the gun may be a little greater than it should be. I've been able to take out Shermans and such at 3.7 and some at 4.3 with it when it really shouldn't. I myself don't play World of Tanks, I'm more of a World of Warships player, but from what I can read from people's opinions, it's fragile with a good gun. It's also in the Soviet tree, which somewhat confuses me, but is still within the truth of who owned what, so whatever. I'm not going to spend the money on buying it as a premium tank, so I'll let those with more experience let me know how it works in that game. Now for a bit of self-indulgence. Whenever I think of an old vehicle like the Tetrarch, what it was and what it was imagined to be, I like to try to figure out what would happen if the Tetrarch was pulled back into service. What would I do or change to it to make it viable, if possible, in today's warfare? Nowadays, war has become something very different from World War II, and even more different than the interwar period where the Tetrarch was designed. However, we can take the core design ideals from it and try to build something similar to it today. Firstly, it wouldn't be a troop transport, it's not a Bradley. I'll be mentioning the Bradley a lot in this section because due to the current war that's going on in Ukraine, it's proven itself to be a very capable light armoured vehicle. So, going off what's proven, we will carry on with that theme. A modern Tetrarch itself could be built to be akin to a destroyer that helps protect aircraft carriers in a naval fleet. Something that could work in pairs or as a group with a Bradley or two to cover flanks, provide supporting fire, or help dismounted infantry get to or from the Bradley, or to or from whatever cover, buildings, what have you. One of the biggest issues with this concept is the proliferation of man-portable anti-tank weapons. Armour nowadays is far more capable than armour of World War II. It's no longer just thick steel that's rolled or cast, but instead has layers of materials and grades of metals to provide better protection without adding significantly more weight. So what do we do for this alternative Tetrarch? Well, given what we're seeing in places like Ukraine, as I mentioned, and what we did see in places such as Afghanistan, the Bradley is well capable of standing up to small arms, up to lighter tank weapons, with ERA armour supplementing it to increase the protection even further. It will make the base plating of the Tetrarch almost double the thickness, and increase the weight over the far too light armour of the original incarnation. So for that, we need a better engine to move it. The original Tetrarch used a 165 horsepower engine for its about 7.5 ton weight. If we were to double the weight of the Tetrarch for the purposes of this hypothetical, to keep the same rough power to weight ratio, we would need to have a 450-500 horsepower engine, which is definitely possible. Modern engines are much more efficient than what they were. It might be a bit of a gas guzzler, but it would keep a degree of the nippiness and agile nature that the original Tetrarch was known for. Well, it was known for its main speed. Its turning was a bit of an issue, but we'll move on to that. Right now, then, we have a vehicle with somewhat the same protection of a typical Bradley and a strong enough engine to move it. Fantastic. What about steering? Now, one of the downsides of that special kind of steering and suspension system the Tetrarch had was that the tracks had to be narrower to be able to quote-unquote bend like it did. Could that be kept? I'm not sure. That may need to be ditched. The extra weight means greater ground pressure, which means wider tracks and or more wheels to spread that pressure out. Unless greater gaps are created in the tracks to allow for some bending in the joints, the suspension and steering are made more complicated and are more fragile, making damage or breakdowns more likely, and repairs taking more time and money, which it's just not worth it. Modern tracked vehicles now use modern steering methods that allow for decent maneuverability without such weaknesses as the thin tracks, and that air and oil suspension that was just far too fragile. So unfortunately, one of the party pieces of the Tetrarch, the bending tracks, is just too much of a liability. Pour one out for our little steery boy. What about armaments? Well, I mentioned before it's a 2-man turret. If we wish to keep roughly the same size as the Tetrarch, we can't up it to a 3-man turret. That's a downside that would need to be kept without changing the Tetrarch too much. A liability for sure, but it'd be offset by changing the main weapon and possibly having some kind of auto-loading weapon, as opposed to the manual loading 2-pounder. Could we fit an autocannon into it? Perhaps. The Bradley's M242 25mm autocannon is probably too large to fit in the turret, given the size frame we're trying to keep in this hypothetical, but something smaller might be able to fit. The Rheinmetall Mark 20 RH202 is a 20mm autocannon, which could, in theory, be modified to fit onto it, given space constraints. Similar to the M242, its ability to pierce tank frontal armor is limited at best. But as we've seen before in Ukraine, it doesn't need to pierce front armor to disable an armored vehicle. It wasn't efficient, but it would give the Tetrarch, the modern incarnation, the ability to ambush or swarm around lighter armored vehicles like the BMP if they use modern armor-piercing ammunition. This allowed for the gunner and commander to maintain situational awareness in combat for longer than the original Tetrarch, who needed one of the two to reload. If it had an automated reloading system, you could have one driver and one gunner who was in a different position, and a commander, all in their own separate seats, much better layout internally, with all the little space there is, so you could have a much more efficient crew. You could put something like a tow missile on top. If it did have to come across heavier armor, other light tanks in the Cold War, like I mentioned before, like the Weasel or what have you, did similar, so it could, in theory, be an option to give this modern Tetrarch hypothetical anti-tank capabilities. Of course, it would also need to keep a machine gun, and nowadays, 30 caliber machine guns, Western make, Eastern make, they're all pretty good. I don't think I have to specify which one is going to go in there. They're all pretty much in the same ballpark, so we'll just carry on from there. So, what do we have now? We have a vehicle in the same rough size as the Tetrarch, with Bradley-esque armor, but with lighter armaments. A 3-man crew, which in theory you could bring down to a 2-man crew, with a little less mobility than the original, but smaller and a touch more agile than a Bradley. Now, as I said before, I will keep going back to the Bradley for comparison. It's just a vehicle that, right now, is proving its worth. I don't know any other lightly armoured vehicles that can really match it right now in Ukraine for its task. The BMPs certainly aren't keeping up with it, so I will keep using it as a benchmark for creating this hypothetical Tetrarch. Now, am I saying that we must go and make the quote-unquote destroyer Tetrarch, the aircraft carrier that is the Bradley? Would it make a huge difference in the war? Is it just pure stupidity of the generals that we're not bringing back this kind of vehicle that could fit this particular niche? No, of course not. It's simply a thought experiment for alternative series of events. Will this vehicle have some use? Perhaps. Now, of course, no armoured vehicle should be working alone, but, well, let's go back to that footage. Having high speed and a half-decent gun for engaging infantry and light armour in tighter spaces such as urban warfare or hiding amongst ruins is an option, but it's very, very situational. A rapid response vehicle in case of a push towards a defensive line, also an option, but without the ability to evacuate those under fire if needs be, it would once again be an escort to a Bradley instead of a standalone response vehicle. And when you have one Bradley responding, which typically is and is designed to be an independent vehicle to some degree to handle the front line for long enough to get in and out, why would you need an escort? In the end, while little me would have loved to see the Tetrarch be brought back to life and kick ass in this regard, it would fill a space that just isn't necessarily needed anymore, just like the original Tetrarch was in World War II. With the IFV being in and of themselves pretty much a light tank in modern combat, with the ability to carry infantry, why would we need a second vehicle? Why not just send 2 Bradleys instead of 1? Instead of one set of spare parts of known operating range and operating methodologies, ammunition, and trained crews, why have 2? Ultimately, the Tetrarch was a decently armed, paper-thin light tank, whose history of operation was littered with failure and inadequacy. However, due to its use as part of glider landings, even if it wasn't effective at all, has garnered it the reputation of the flying tank. A cute little thing that had no place, but tried its best to some people, a waste of metal to others. To me, it'll always have a special place as the first tank that really got me into military history and armoured vehicles. It didn't need to be good or be widespread to be interesting to me, and got me started on looking at the lesser known ideas and creations that became military equipment. So there, but for the grace of God, goes the Tetrarch. I salute the efforts, I lament the execution. If you've gotten this far in the video, then I thank you from the bottom of my heart. This is a bit of a test, but it's also a way for me to practice my research and writing abilities, as well as simply talk about things I like. I do plan on doing a master's in strategic studies once I build up the funds, but for now I'm simply an enthusiast making a video, and possibly more videos as a way to keep the mind focused. If you want to research more into this topic, I'd recommend A17 Tetrarch Tank, A Technical History by PM Knight, British Tanks of the Red Army by Peter Samsonov. The Tank Museum in Bovington has a lot of good information about it, as well as other blogs and individual accounts by other historians about the Tetrarch. Thank you all very much, and back to the regularly scheduled programming of live streams. Take care of yourselves.